At Atlanta International Airport, a gate agent tore up a black pilot's boarding pass, convinced she had no right to wear the uniform she'd earned. Fueled by prejudice and pride, Karen Whitmore turned a weary captain's routine trip into a public humiliation. But when Captain Danielle Reed revealed her wings, everything, and everyone, shifted. Just wait until you see how one act of dignity grounded an entire flight and lifted justice sky high. Atlanta International Airport pulsed with the rhythm of early morning travel. Rolling suitcases clattered against polished floors, overhead announcements echoed over the hum of conversation, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel. Yet near Gate 32, amid the bustle of departing travelers, the energy shifted. Captain Danielle Reed stood in line, her crisp Navy uniform immaculate despite the exhausting night behind her. She had landed in Atlanta only hours earlier after piloting an overnight flight from Chicago. Tired but proud, she was deadheading, traveling off duty to her next assignment in Dallas. Holding her boarding pass in one hand and a small leather bag in the other, she waited her turn at the counter. When her moment arrived, she stepped forward and offered a polite smile to the gate agent. "Morning," she said, handing over her ticket. The woman behind the counter, Karen Whitmore, barely acknowledged the greeting. Without returning the smile, she glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning Danielle from head to toe. First her face, then her uniform, lingering just long enough for Danielle to sense that something was off. "You can't board this flight," Karen announced, her tone flat but final. At first, Danielle thought she had misheard. She tilted her head slightly, waiting for an explanation. "I'm a pilot," she said calmly, lifting her voice just enough to be clear over the background noise. "Repositioning for my next assignment in Dallas." She began to reach for her leather credential holder, prepared to show her official identification. But before she could produce it, Karen reached across the counter, grabbed the boarding pass, and, with deliberate precision, tore it cleanly in half. A crisp rip echoed through the waiting area. Conversations halted. A family stopped mid-step as the sound cut through the din like a sudden strike of a bell. Several passengers turned their heads, curious but hesitant to speak. That sharp tear seemed to carve a line between the ordinary morning rush and the moment that now hung, suspended, in the air. Karen dropped the pieces of the ticket back toward Danielle with a slight flick of her wrist. Her voice was lower now, but it carried an edge that made it impossible to ignore. "Not in that seat, you're not," she said. "You people always think rules don't apply to you." The words landed heavily, coated in a tone Danielle recognized too well. In her career, she had endured occasional skepticism, subtle pauses before taking her commands seriously, hesitant glances from those unused to seeing her in the captain's chair. But this was different. Anger surged, sharp and immediate. It was not the mild frustration that passed quickly, nor the confusion that could be explained away. This was the kind of anger born when dignity is tested in full view of strangers, when an intentional act strips away both position and respect. She straightened her posture, holding her gaze firmly on the gate agent. "Ma'am," Danielle said, her voice measured, steady enough to keep the moment contained, "you've just denied boarding to a captain with the company you represent." Karen folded her arms loosely, a faint tilt of her head suggesting she was unmoved. "You can call whoever you want," she replied. "You're not getting on." Passengers nearby exchanged quick glances. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet Danielle's gaze, while others studied Karen with a newfound wariness. Danielle could feel the space around her tighten, not physically, but in the silent way that moments of public conflict draw invisible lines between witness and participant. The boarding area was still. An announcement about another flight played in the background, but no one seemed to hear it. Danielle's heart pounded, yet her training, years of disciplined command, kept her movements deliberate. Her anger flared beneath that calm, an ember refusing to dim, waiting for the next breath to decide how far the moment might go. In the uniform she had earned through thousands of flight hours, she stood there, a pilot, unshaken in posture, but burning inside, aware that every second was etching itself into the memory of the crowd around her. This was not only about a ticket. It was about standing in a place where authority, experience, and dedication could be torn in half as quickly as paper. Danielle moved a few steps away from the counter, creating space between herself and the gate agent. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, a subtle tremor revealing what her posture tried to hide. The pieces of her torn boarding pass still lay on the counter behind her, but she refused to glance back. It was impossible to ignore the sensation that every person in the waiting area had turned inward to watch her. Though few met her eyes, she felt their attention, the small tilts of heads, the quick whispers traded with companions, the sidelong looks that slipped away when she noticed them. No one spoke beyond those quiet exchanges, no one challenged what had just happened. Yet their silence carried weight. Not indifference exactly, but the unease of knowing and choosing not to act. A shifting of bags at feet, the repeated checking of phones, all the ways people retreat when truth stands in plain sight. Danielle drew in a breath, centering herself. Years in the cockpit had taught her that the most turbulent moments demand steady control. Anger could blind, frustration could derail, and neither had a place in her response now. She pressed her shoulders back, anchoring her focus. Still, beneath that composure, the sting of humiliation spread. It was not just the tearing of a ticket, it was the public nature of the act, the message it sent to anyone watching that her uniform and credentials had failed to protect her from suspicion. Two airport security officers approached, their polished badges catching the light above the gate. One moved toward Karen, speaking briefly, then signaled for Danielle to step closer. Karen stood off to the side, arms folded, her gaze steady yet carrying the faint glint of satisfaction, as if the scene confirmed something she was certain of. The taller officer addressed Danielle. "Ma'am, may I see your identification?" His tone was formal, yet not unkind. Danielle nodded and retrieved her credential wallet. She flipped it open, revealing the embossed identification card and the gleaming metal insignia, her captain's wings. The officer examined them closely, then looked up. "Captain Reed, wait," he said, a note of realization breaking through his professional tone. "You're a pilot with Delta Atlantic?" "Yes, sir," she replied evenly, though her voice softened just slightly. She let the light reflect off the wings for a moment, not as a challenge, but as proof. The reaction was immediate. Several passengers gasped quietly. A few raised their phones higher, adjusting angles to capture the exchange. From the rear of the waiting area, a man muttered just loudly enough for those around him to hear, "That gate lady really messed up." Karen's posture lost some of its edge. Her arms dropped slightly, and a faint pallor overtook her face. She shifted her gaze between Danielle and the officer, the confidence in her expression thinning as the details took shape before her. The officer turned toward Karen, his expression now sharper. "Ma'am, did you refuse boarding to one of our own?" Karen's reply stumbled out in pieces. I thought she was lying." Her voice carried the weight of uncertainty that had not been present moments earlier. Danielle's jaw tightened. She felt each word press against a deeper place, a place shaped by years of measured patience, where proof of ability often had to be doubled to match the trust others gave freely to someone else. Every assumption in Karen's statement was familiar. Every hesitation was part of a pattern Danielle had confronted repeatedly. It was not just about being questioned. It was about the isolation in those moments, the knowledge that even in the uniform she had earned through skill, discipline, and countless hours aloft, she could still be unseen. The loneliness that accompanied that truth was its own quiet weight, heavier than the events themselves. She stood there, holding her captain's wings with measured steadiness, the silence around her filled with recorded images, muted whispers, and the awareness that the moment had crossed into something larger than just a boarding dispute. The air at Gate 32 had shifted from tense silence to restless murmurs. What had begun as disbelief was now turning into collective unease. The quiet recording of phones filled the background like a low static hum. Through the crowd's whispering, a new presence broke through, calm, composed, authoritative. Airport management had arrived. Two supervisors in navy blazers approached the counter, exchanging quiet words with the security officers before turning to Danielle. Behind them, the pilots scheduled to operate the Dallas flight walked up, confusion on their faces that quickly hardened into understanding as they saw her still standing near the counter, uniform neat but expression strained. First Officer Tom Jacobs was the first to speak. He was tall, steady, and spoke with the firm confidence of someone who knew exactly where the truth stood. "That's our Captain Reed," he said, his voice clear enough to reach every corner of the waiting area. "She's on the Dallas roster." "And you just ripped her ticket." For a heartbeat, there was silence again. A different kind now. The kind that settles in when certainty meets exposure. Karen's eyes flicked from Tom to Danielle, then to the supervisors. Her earlier certainty had vanished. The managers stepped behind the counter, their expressions neutral but tense as they examined the record. People had stopped pretending not to look. Passengers turned in their seats. Some had their phones angled openly. Screens glowed, recording each word and gesture. Then came the ripple, the rising sound of murmurs filling the space. They weren't whispers of curiosity anymore, but voices of protest. A woman near the boarding door said quietly, "That's not right." Someone else added, louder, "Let her get on that flight." The noise grew, steady and rhythmic, a pulse of human reaction turning the tide. Moments later, posts began appearing online. Photos, short clips with captions that captured more than any single statement could. "Gate agent tears pilot's ticket." The story was already leaving the airport before the plane ever could. Danielle stood centered in all of it, her anger cooled into something sharper. Resolve. She turned toward the lead supervisor, who had been conferring quietly with one of the operations coordinators. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured but carried a weight that silenced the growing noise. "If I can't board this aircraft," she said, "neither will my crew. We maintain command responsibility. The flight doesn't leave." It wasn't a threat, and it didn't need to be. It was a statement of fact, procedural, professional, and absolute. The supervisor hesitated, realizing that every eye in the terminal was on him now. His hands shifted slightly against his clipboard, a subtle sign of the gravity settling in. He looked around, at the gathered passengers, the scattered recording phones, and the faces of the flight crew standing shoulder to shoulder with their captain. For a moment, the only sound was the distant echo of a boarding call for another gate. Then came his answer, spoken with quiet authority. "Understood, Captain," he said. "The flight is grounded pending review." The announcement was short, almost administrative, but its effect rippled instantly. Karen dropped her gaze, her hands frozen above the counter. The remaining officer stepped back, as if instinctively respecting the shift that had occurred. And the crowd, previously on the edge of uncertain observation, finally found its voice. Applause began hesitantly, somewhere from the center of the sitting area, then spread outward until it filled the gate. Some passengers clapped slowly in support. Others called out words of encouragement. The tone wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, respectful, like a collective exhale that acknowledged both wrong and right being seen in the same breath. Danielle's shoulders softened slightly. She breathed out, releasing air she hadn't realized she had been holding. The slight tremor that had lingered in her hands earlier now faded as she looked toward her crew, who nodded quietly in solidarity. Hope emerged. Not a fragile dream of reassurance, but the grounded kind, born from courage and truth. It carried strength, not softness. It wasn't about victory. It was about validation, about standing tall when silence would have been easier. As the applause continued, Danielle offered a faint nod to the passengers who had chosen to speak, to record, to bear witness. For the first time that morning, she was neither isolated nor unseen. Behind her uniform and professionalism, humanity had stepped forward, not as an audience but as a silent collective willing to stand with her. In the crowded heart of an airport, amid noise, light, and motion, a single act of dignity had transformed humiliation into purpose. And though the plane remained grounded, something far greater had taken flight. 2 days later, the world beyond Gate 32 had caught up with what had happened there. The video that began as a few scattered clips recorded on phones had spread across news networks and social media platforms, gathering momentum with every share. Headlines carried the same astonished rhythm. Gate agent rips black pilot's ticket, then sees her wings. Each replayed frame told the story in silence before the captions even appeared. The tension at the gate, the confrontation, and then the quiet authority with which Captain Danielle Reed had reclaimed her ground. What had started as an unjust moment became a glowing proof of composure, not conflict. Within hours, voices from across the nation joined in its echo. Airlines issued public statements about accountability, professionalism, and training programs that would reinforce respect across all ranks. Terms like diversity and inclusion moved quickly into company press releases, but to those who had seen the video, the meaning was deeper than corporate language. The message had come from Danielle herself, a lesson in grace under fire, the kind that no press statement could replicate. For some, the story faded as the next news cycle rose, but for others it became something more enduring, a reflection of possibility. Across classrooms, aviation academies, and local community centers, instructors replayed that short clip. They used it to show what leadership looked like when dignity spoke louder than reaction. In homes across the country, little black girls watched the same scene again and again. Their eyes lit up not at the confrontation, but at the sight of a woman in uniform, composed, self-assured, and in control of her truth. They didn't see defeat. They saw proof that no act of dismissal could eclipse confidence built on earned skill. They saw a pilot, a leader, a symbol who reminded them that calm resilience can command any room. That evening, Danielle stood on the tarmac near her hangar, the orange tones of sunset pouring across the polished metal of the plains lined up beside her. The events of the past week felt distant now, yet the weight of them remained in the quiet between her thoughts. Her phone vibrated again. Another message, another headline. Colleagues from across the aviation world were reaching out. Some had faced similar scrutiny in quieter ways. Others wrote to say her courage had reminded them why they wore their uniforms with pride. Messages from strangers filled her inbox. Words of thanks for her calm strength, her restraint, her ability to turn humiliation into a moment of clarity. Danielle scrolled through them slowly, reading snippets here and there. She paused on a message from a young flight student in Texas. "Because of you, I'm not afraid to keep going." That single line tightened Danielle's throat in the best way. Not out of sadness, but recognition. Sometimes courage echoed loudest in quiet corners where dreams began. Above her, the sky stretched wide and open. The hum of engines preparing for departure rolled in gentle waves across the pavement. She reached into her pocket and held her captain's wings between her fingers. They caught the fading light, gleaming faintly, the same way they had in the terminal when she lifted them before the officer. Out there, they had been proof. Here, they were affirmation. She hadn't wanted attention, nor had she sought retribution. What she had done was something smaller and greater at once. She had chosen dignity when anger would have been easier, had shown presence when pride might have fractured. The world had seen her grounded that morning, but they misunderstood what it meant. Smiling softly, she whispered to the still air around her, "They grounded the wrong person that day." She lifted her gaze toward the endless horizon, streaked in gold and lavender. In that moment, the sky no longer represented distance or duty. It represented freedom. What seemed like an ending at an airport gate had unfolded into something larger, a quiet triumph not defined by applause but by endurance. And, as the evening deepened, Captain Danielle Reed stood steady against the glow of aircraft lights, her wings catching each glimmer of dusk, a reflection of the future she had fought for, vast, unbound, and ready for flight.